Welcome to GAF Lockdown, our regular show where we educate ourselves for the struggle to come. Today, we're going to be talking with organizers from the Stay Grounded campaign. But first, let me remind you what is GAF and how you can get involved. The Green Anti-Capitalist Front is an alliance of groups and individuals united by a belief that capitalism is one of the core causes of the environmental crisis, threatening us all, and that if we don't act now, the cost of that crisis will fall on the poor and powerless. If you want to get involved, you can contact one of the existing groups, which you can find in places like London, Birmingham, Glasgow, and Edinburgh, among others. And all the contact info is on the website. But also remember that GAF is a front, and as such, as long as you agree with our aims and principles, you can create your own collective or take action under the GAF banner without having to ask for permission. Finally, before we begin, I'd like to shout out a campaign that we like to give a bit of attention. Today, we only have a single shout out, and it's going to be to a crowdfunding campaign for some comrades in Greece who are facing state repression. They were arrested by police, implicated with some protests that happened back in October, I believe, and they are facing really, really high a bail money to be able that they need to pay, and currently due to the situation with the lockdown and all that, they just don't have the means to pay for it. So they're asking for international solidarity for people to support them and give wherever you can. You can find all the info in a recent article we published in the blog, asking for solidarity. There you can find the link to the crowdfunding page and read all the info as well of the case and what is going on and what they're facing. So that will be on greenanticapitalist.org, I believe. Yes. And also, if you, and before we begin, also for the people who are gonna be in the call today, we have a bit of a code of conduct just so we can have all a great time. So I'm gonna be really, really quick. We just ask you to be respectful, to interrupt people when they are speaking, and when we encourage fruitful disagreements, please do so in a constructive manner without defaulting to offensive or patronizing behavior. Also listen to the facilitator, which in this case is me, mainly. Although we plan on running these sessions in the loosest manner possible, however, when the facilitator gives an instruction, please follow it. Be mindful of how much space you take up. All participants are requested to be brief and concise when speaking, to leave the space to everyone to participate. If you ramble for too long, the facilitator will interrupt you and request you allow someone else to speak. And finally, challenge oppressive behaviors and hierarchies. All participants are requested to check their privilege and refrain from replicating oppressive behaviors and informal hierarchies within the readings group space. The live stream space. If you do so, expect to be called out on it. And yeah, that's all of it. I don't want to wait any longer. So next, I'm gonna ask our guests today from Stay Grounded to introduce themselves. So whoever wants to start.
Off you go, Cal.
Right. Yeah, I'm Callum. Yeah, I'm organised with Stay Grounded, and I'm based in the UK. Yeah, over to you, Steve.
Yeah, I'm Steve. Also on the coordinating committee for Stay Grounded, which we call the Turtles. Primarily, I do stuff for Rising Tide in the UK, Climate Justice Direct Action Network, and I'm sort of the list master, as Rise Up call it, for the UK chapter of Stay Grounded.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being here today. And to start the interview, so on your website, you call yourself a global network or over 160 member organizations. Could you briefly tell us how Stay Grounded came into being and how such a large and geographically spread network works? I don't know which
Shall I
one.
do that? I'll do it if you like.
All yours, Steve.
Yeah, I think it was about 5 years ago, 2016, I think it was. The International Civil Aviation Organization was their annual conference, and it was the one where they decided where the COP process had given them permission to go off and get their own house in order with regards to an emissions reduction strategy. And for those of you who don't know what they came up with, it's called CORSIA, and it's almost 100% offsetting strategy. So business as usual, really. So there was a lot of groups around the world were going to be doing actions on the dates of that conference, and some were in contact with each other, and they ended up, I think, being about 7 or 8 different organisations who all did actions on that day or during the period of the conference. And after that, it sort of grew and grew, really. They decided that it was better to be in touch, swap ideas and tactics, collaborate together on certain things, and the sort of network was born from there, really. And since then, it's gone from strength to strength. I think there's over 160 members, but there's also a position paper which the members have to agree to the principles that are in it, and about nearly 250 organisations worldwide have signed up to that. We'd welcome GAF to be one of them. And now there are some territorial chapters that have emerged. There's a Stay Grounded UK, there's one in France, there's one that covers Iberia, so Spain and Portugal. There's an embryonic one in Germany. And we've also been having some regional meetings to try and set up regional networks, one in Latin and Central America, and another in Asia, so India, Nepal, China, Indonesia, Philippines, mostly is where we've got members. So once a quarter, those meetings happen where we share ideas, and at least once a year, sometimes twice, we have an international gathering where we make policy.
Yeah, that's really impressive that such a large coalition of group has been able to coordinate under a single campaign. So
one other thing I could say, if sorry to interrupt you, is so it started off as direct action groups and direct action networks, but it soon became inclusive of other organisations. But part of the position paper is that civil disobedience is a tactic. So even if they're not direct action groups, then they still have to sign up to agree that some members of the network will be taking direct action. So.
No, which is really, really great, and we will definitely support that. So getting into a bit more into what State Grounded is actually about. When you talk about anti-aviation, I think maybe a lot of people have a bit of a knee-jerk reaction and think that you're trying to stop them from traveling or something like that. Could you tell us about what Stay Grounded is really about, and sort of what are your aims and get maybe the core principles?
Go on, Steve. I think you're better to answer all these questions.
Okay, well, you have to do some. Well, so we've got this position paper, which is just trying to find it myself now. So we don't usually say we're an anti-aviation network, probably for that very reason you suggest. So the position paper is called 13 Steps for a Just Transport System and for Rapidly Reducing Aviation. So obviously we do want to almost terminate aviation, apart from particular emergency reasons. We recently we had a working group to produce a paper on emissions that included non-CO2 emissions and included the emissions being released at altitude, or radiative forcing it's known as, and there's the jury's out on how much extra emissions would come from emitting them at a higher altitude. But after grinding all the numbers down, generally worldwide the industry likes to say it only accounts for 2% of emissions, but if you take those factors I just mentioned into account, it's about 6%, which is quite a large amount for one individual sector of the world economy. And aviation has been growing steadily, still growing, and it's growing at a much faster rate than any other sector of the world economy. So the position paper, it's got 13 different points. So it take quite a long while to cover them all, but I can briefly mention what they are. I mean, the first one is a just transition of the workers that work not just in the aviation sector, so not just airlines and airports, but subsidiary industries and tourism that's solely dependent on aviation. Also, supporting shifts to other modes of transport other than aviation, and particularly with regard to freight, to support an economy of short distances. So to try and reduce the demand for goods that are produced or grown or whatever far away from the economies that are importing them. Another thing would be to change the habits and modes of living of people. So like we're doing now, business and social online conferencing instead of excessive air travel. I'm not quite sure the exact figure. I'm sure Callum will be able to say, but it's a very tiny percentage of people that take a huge percentage of the flights worldwide. And that is reflected in every country in the world. It's uncanny how the ratio is really similar in every country. So it's the elite that are causing the most damage by taking the most flights, a lot of them completely unnecessary. There's really no reason anymore to get on a plane, particularly from business airports like London City, and nip over to France or Amsterdam for a meeting, or even a stag night or a hen night. It's just not necessary anymore, and we can't afford it in a state of climate emergency. So there's a few others. Obviously, the concept of climate justice and land rights and human rights for indigenous peoples, protection of those. A lot of airport expansion directly affects indigenous populations. For example, the Maasai in Kenya did a fantastic action where they drove their cattle onto the runway, which was a great action. Good photos. Also, for strong political commitments to keep global temperature increases to below 1.5. And then we've got like a list of principles of things that we must avoid if we're to meet those previous things I mentioned. So no new airports, no further airport expansion, a denial of the privileges of the aviation sector so far. So they get huge subsidies and tax breaks. Kerosene, aviation fuel, is virtually taxed nowhere in the world. I think there's 5 countries that put any tax on it at all. There's barely any value-added tax for the countries that have that, or other forms of passenger taxes. And if there are, they're pitifully small and not related to distances travelled or things like that. And that would also include no more airline or airport bailouts in the present circumstances. Some sort of hold on air travel industry marketing, so advertising, frequent flyer programs, they've all got to stop or be reduced. And then some of the big ones are an end to offsetting to allegedly counteract emissions. I mean, offsets don't actually take any CO2 out of the atmosphere, which is what we've got to do now. Even if everybody stopped emitting CO2 now, we're still on course to break the 1.5 degrees. So we've got to find ways of drawing that CO2 out of the atmosphere. So offsetting is not an option. To stop the use of biofuels, not just as a kerosene substitute, but for the deforestation and land damage that it causes, including grabbing the land from those who own it or those who use it. And then finally, to debunk the illusion of techno fixes for aviation, which would include things like biofuel use, hydrogen fuels, anything that perpetuates business as usual, really, has all got to stop for us to stand any chance of reaching 1.5 degrees, which I think we'll all be fairly surprised if we manage to do that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I would add. Yeah, I think that Steve makes most of the kind of key points. I think to link it back to your question around sort of stopping everyone traveling. I think we do to take a stand that's that's just based on what we have right now and the climate emergency, as Steve says, which is we need to cut emissions, and the only way we know of that's going to do that right now, guaranteed, is to reduce the amount of flights that we take or that are taken. And to be honest, that even just getting that as a message across to certainly people in the aviation industry and politicians that's as radical as anything right now. Actually, just getting people to accept that there should be fewer flights, because there may be a lot of the solutions of in inverted commas solutions that people sort of advocate, certainly industry advocate, are of deeply questionable, almost almost guaranteed not to reduce carbon. Things like offsetting. Biofuels have enormous other impacts. There's a few things that might decarbonize some flight in the future, but they're not going to do it in the timescales we need for the climate emergency. So we have to reduce flying dramatically. And I think that in terms of those numbers that Steve alluded to, the fact that in the UK the numbers are that around 70% of the flights are taken by 15% of people. So you've got a very small number of a small proportion of the country taking well over 2/3 of the flights in any given year, and those people within that group are tend to be well off, tend to be traveling more than 3 times, and tend often they're all traveling more than 3 times, and they also tend to have second houses abroad. It's the message is we need to reduce flying, and there's an obvious group, which is a wealthy, privileged group, which should be doing more cutting faster.
So it doesn't include a working class family who can only afford to have a package holiday for 2 weeks in Spain. They're not the people causing the damage. It's the elite business people that are. One other thing is we got some funding last year to support frequent flyer campaigns in several different countries in Europe. So for the the sort of thing where people sign up to pledge to not to fly for the year or not to fly for 3 months or whatever it is. There's an awful lot of those. There's probably one of those organisations in every country in Europe at least. So trying to bring them together as well has been quite useful to try and change attitudes.
So talking about this specifically, talking about some campaigns and action more specifically, these principles are really, really, really good, and I really, really like them. But now we have to talk about how we are trying to achieve them, or different groups are trying to achieve them. So could you tell us about a bit about your current campaigns and plans right now? So like the most important campaigns going on.
Well, I can do a few, and then you can do a few if you like, Cal.
Okay.
So we're about to launch a paper that we've been working on for far too long, just transition in the aviation sector, where we've managed to draw up a set of principles, and we've been working with people that are in the industry, so trade unions that represent air traffic control workers and other ground staff workers, pilots and aero engineers. So it's not just climate activists like we are who have been working on it, and that's going to be released. I think it's now the 4th February that we're going to release that. So we're going to have a big push out there. But there's a lot of organisations have been issuing papers like that, and also papers like that specifically for the aviation industry. But what we've been calling for is that any money that there is out there available, whoever's spending it, and it's usually us if we pay taxes, has been used to bail out airlines and airports, and we're saying that money should be used to transition the jobs of those workers. That should be the primary task in the present circumstances, and it's just an opportunity that we should take. So we've got various working groups. Usually at each annual gathering, we discuss what we think is going to be important for the next year, and then we'll form a working group of people from all over the planet to produce a paper or organise, let's say, a week of action or information papers like the non-CO2 effects paper, and they're sort of coming out all the time, really. The linking up flying less programs, that was called Let's Stay Grounded campaign, which we got some funding for. And I mean, a lot of it does depend on what you can get money for, because a lot of this stuff costs money. Everybody's looking for funding, and there's fewer and fewer organisations that are giving it. So sometimes you have to make some compromises as to what you might feel comfortable politically doing. So, for example, I said I'm part of Rising Tide UK, who are completely opposed to the COP process and the Kyoto process before that. But one of the things Stay Grounded did was we produced a submission to the UN IPCC on the Talanoa dialogue, which was for a consultation mostly with particular interest groups and indigenous peoples over what was missing from the COP process. And obviously our angle was that aviation emissions were missing from the COP process. So we engaged with that process, just because sometimes you have to make some compromises to get further forward.
Yeah, and I think just to add to what Steve said, it's kind of it tends to be a mixture of providing information for people and also kind of bringing groups together or people together in particular ways, and sort of helping activate people. So yeah, as Steve talked about some of the reports we've done, and a lot of those are also collaborative with trade unions and on the just transition, and with scientists on non-CO2 effects. And the Let's Stay Grounded campaign is also about sort of bringing people who might want to pledge not to fly, but that's also trying to take them a step further and suggest other things. So along with that is a campaign to encourage organisations to look at their travel policies and maybe think about how they might be able to decarbonise them. And so encouraging people who sign their pledge to not fly themselves, so then maybe at least raise the question with their place they work or an organisation local to them. And we also there's also or get involved in a group locally that's resisting an airport expansion or something like that. So it's also trying to kind of go a little bit further than just sort of collectivism, sort of sign a petition online. And I think as Steve mentioned, we also did sort of action weeks in the past. So one of the one of the first things that Stay Grounded sort of emerged from was a coordinated set of actions around the world in different countries resisting airports, and we've done sort of a few of those and kept sort of that direct action kind of element as part of what we do as a network in terms of coordinating and helping groups to do that. And I think that this coming year we're also embarking on a new campaign on sort of around sort of reframing aviation, so around what sort of how we talk about aviation and trying to really develop a new narrative around how aviation sits in the new economy that we need to kind of prevent a total climate breakdown, and also in the context of obviously the new economy that's emerging from the coronavirus crisis, and again that'll be kind of providing kind of doing new work in terms of framing and in terms of messaging to help us and all the groups around the networks around the world talk about aviation, and as well as also really try and kind of reach that out to people and activate groups and help them adopt and start using that messaging.
So since we're talking already about the sort of like the global pandemic, one of the effects it has is that it grinded to a halt a lot of air travel. So it feels like the environmental impacts of aviation have been again like become a topic of discussion a bit. Have you found that this has helped you in any way in your campaign? And how are you planning to kind of like take this on forward and develop this campaign?
Yeah, it's definitely helped. In fact, it's brought us money. So we were running a campaign against bailouts all through this from the beginning of the summer onwards, and we applied for some funding from I think 2 different funding organisations to help run this campaign and coordinate it, and they basically both said no at the beginning, so we did it anyway. And then they subsequently funded us because they thought it was good. So I don't know what the lesson is to be learnt there, but obviously there is one. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely helped. I mean, it's shone a light on aviation emissions in particular, and the bailouts just continue. More and more. Literally billions of pounds. In fact, just trying to find it now. So I sent an email out yesterday to our UK list. The Chief Executive, or whatever he's called, Director General of the International Air Travel Association, he's now calling for another $80 billion to help the airline industry survive the pandemic.
Wow.
This is on top of an eye-watering $170 billion that have already been received from governments, he says, but it's not governments, it's us. We're paying for it, and in the future we're going to be paying for it for decades for bailing out all these companies that are really not necessary, competing with each other when they don't need to compete with each other, flying the same routes as each other, which they don't need to fly at all. So there's been a couple of interesting reports written on government support of airlines during the pandemic, but virtually, as I've sort of mentioned earlier, hardly any of them mention much about transitioning those jobs away from the sector, which, to be honest, seems a fairly obvious thing that you might talk about to me.
Yeah, I think that the two, it shone a light both on the industry and things like Virgin and Richard Branson early on, just crying out, demanding money from taxpayers. I think has done a lot to kind of wake the public up to just how the priorities of the airlines and the aviation industry generally. I mean, I guess for people like Ryanair, no one really ever liked Ryanair. So no one really ever they've never traded on goodwill or kind of customer affection. But I think even companies like Virgin and realize that they're all, not quite the sort of like, I don't know, these sort of paradigm examples of good corporations. I think on the other hand, in a slightly surprising way, like a lot of messaging from other organizations around or people talking about what they can do to reduce their carbon impact on an individual level as well has been like suddenly not flying has kind of risen up the agenda a bit. I think people have just become aware of just how much flying does go on. And we're seeing that more prominently on people's kind of suggestions of things that they're going to do, or equally things that people would advocate other people doing to reduce their carbon footprint, above dietary change and other things that historically have been sort of more obvious go-tos and more popular. So I don't totally understand why that is, because if anything, you might expect that stopping everyone traveling for a year would make more people want to travel rather than the opposite. But it does seem to have had an effect, on the organisations. And I think the other thing airlines have done is obviously like really failed to refund customers quite dramatically, and that I think has really lost them a huge amount of support, because they've offered credit. They've offered kind of credit tokens rather than actual refunds, taking months to issue refunds, and all of these things I think have really kind of really pissed people off effectively. Yeah.
I mean, it's just been a succession of own goals, really. I mean, as Callum says, everyone hates Ryanair, but the government gave them a £600 million, 1.5% loan over 10 years. That's if they ever pay it back. And I mean, the maddest one was a company called Flypop, who were given £1 million loan from the Coronavirus Future Fund in the UK, and yet they have no aircraft and they haven't got an operating license. So when you get stories like that, where even somebody that knows nothing about climate change, nothing about aviation, could think, well, that's a bit weird. That's just ridiculous. And of course, people that live near airports have suddenly discovered peace and quiet. So I think that's made quite a big difference. People are beginning to appreciate, with the noise that's decreased due to lockdowns, how better life could be without all those noises, whether they be from aircraft or whatever. But the bailouts and the funding, I mean, they haven't stopped with airlines, and in particular in the UK, airports. Almost all local airports and regional airports have got some stakeholder or share ownership by local authorities, local councils, and that's if those local authorities don't entirely own them. So they've been giving, it's not income taxpayers' money, but it is council taxpayers' money from the local residents. So, for example, the Manchester Airports Group, which covers Manchester, Stansted and Nottingham airports, have been bailed out to the tune of £260 million so far, and each local authority, so I think there's 14 local authorities in Manchester, plus those in Nottingham and some of the ones in Essex and Hertfordshire, Stansted, have all chipped in to bail out those airports. But it's happening all the time up and down the country. We've been trying to keep a list. It's actually impossible to keep up. There's so much money being thrown at the sector, and it's all being wasted, and none of it is being spent or targeted on the workers. Oh, one more thing about that before I get off my hobby horse is, in particular, Rolls-Royce, who jet engines is one of their biggest products. The same week that they announced 9,000 job cuts in Rolls-Royce, so not transition, but actually sacking people, they received £2 billion in loans from the government. And they've been in discussion since for another £1 billion in loans. So that's just unbelievable, eye-watering amounts of money, really.
Yeah, it goes to show where the priorities are for these people. And since we're on the topic on like workers, what has been the relationship, the engagement with different trade unions in the UK with your campaign? Yeah, how did you respond to it?
Shall I do that one, Cal?
Yeah, well, I can take. I mean, so we have one trade union. One UK trade union is a member. But I mean, broadly, we're looking basically through this just transition sort of report, which we have sort of written with, as I say, people who've come out of the industry and with people from trade unions to kind of engage a bit more widely. I mean, broadly, most trade unions, I think, generally have often pursued a kind of protect jobs narrative around airports, and particularly around expansion. They've seen treated expansion as an opportunity for more jobs, or at the very least, an opportunity to slow the kind of job losses from automation and other drivers, rather than engaging in a what we see as a more positive narrative around actually transitioning people, developing a program where people can actually be transitioned away in a just fashion and be either find alternative good jobs or retrain people and reskill people. I think there's kind of hints of movement. I mean, there was actually just today there was a document that came out of the biggest trade union in Spain that did actually mention diversifying their tourist economy away from one so dependent on aviation and towards one more sort of more local and more grounded in local heritage. And so, I think we're starting to see things shift. And I think, again, looking back to the coronavirus crisis, I think that the kind of profound sort of shock that has had on everything is allowing space for rethinking in a more profound way. So hopefully we can kind of, with our this report that we've put together, which it was not really a report, it's more of a sort of discussion document, isn't it? It's kind of we're trying to open the space to have a conversation. So hopefully that will prove a useful tool in trying to engage more trade unions in what we really see is just a more positive narrative around the fact that from where they're sat, jobs are disappearing in aviation anyway. I mean, because of automation, because these airlines and airports want to employ as few people as possible. Not least because people go on strike. So the narrative is a much more positive narrative where we actually try and find people in aviation whose jobs are under threat, either because of automation or because we need to decarbonize, and there's an urgency to that. That actually we should be, airlines and government should be, investing in them rather than in the airlines.
Yeah, that Spanish union, I don't know what it stands for, and I have no Spanish at all, but it's the CCOO.
Comisiones Obreras.
I don't even know what sector they have workers in. Does anyone
all
know?
kinds, I think.
Is it? It's like a big, like the GMB in the UK, is it? Maybe?
Yeah, it's really big.
Yeah, one thing. I mean, it's the Public and Commercial Services Union that we've been working with, and they used to be mostly a civil service union, but due to lots of successive privatisations and contracting out, they've now got, I think, over 80% of their workers are actually in the private sector. But I mean, the big problems in the UK are Unite, the union, and the GMB, who have a lot of workers that are based at airports. And I think we need to make the distinction between the leadership, in inverted commas, of some of these unions and the rank and file and some local union branches who are completely on side. So, for example, in Leeds, Bradford, where the airport is trying to expand, one of a couple of dozen airports in the UK that got their retaliation in first before the Heathrow verdict and put in planning applications to expand. There's a lot of organisations being done by the regional council of the TUC there that includes branches of the GMB and of Unite. So, the workers that actually work on the ground and do the job in the industry a lot of those are on our side, on the side of climate justice. You might say, if you're being corny, but it's the leadership that we have the problem with, and all they're interested in is preserving existing jobs. So I think there is a big job to be done in getting trade unions to adopt transition strategies, because at the moment I think that they think that if they did that, there'd be turkeys voting for Christmas, which is not correct.
Yeah, hopefully we'll see more positive change in that direction in the future. And seeing as some of us are London-based, and the Heathrow expansion has been a hot topic for years, that's something we really have to talk about, I think. So for for people who don't know, earlier this year, the court ruled against the expansion, but the airport expansion has now won their appeal, and it looks like it's once again on the table. So would you like to talk about that a bit and kind of like bring us up to speed with what's going on?
Steve's definitely the expert there.
I can do that. Yeah, you'll probably have to shut me up though.
We'll time you.
Well, yeah. It'll never be built. Simply. So there's two things to remember about that Heathrow case, which has been going on for 3 years, is that when it starts, which was with a judicial review, the law is frozen in time at that moment. So all the things that happened since then that would meant we would have won the case in the end can't be taken into account. So the UK declaring a zero carbon, net, not zero carbon, that's an important mistake I've made there, net zero, which is completely different, by 2050, that can't be taken into account. Parliament declaring a climate emergency, that can't be taken into account. The IPCC 1.5 special report, that can't be taken into account. None of those things could be taken into account in that case because they all happened after the case started. However, the case wasn't just about a third runway at Heathrow. It was about the airport's national policy statement, which is each sector of the economy has got a national policy statement, which is like the chief planning document for that sector. So this is the one for the whole of aviation in the UK, not just airports, but all aviation. And at the time, another thing that couldn't be taken into account was that they rely completely, as the government does, on advice from the Committee on Climate Change. So the Committee on Climate Change had given advice for all other sectors other than aviation. So you might think that's a bit suspicious. Were they waiting for the Heathrow case to conclude before they gave that advice? And the answer is yes, they probably were. Anyway, they've now given their advice, but that couldn't be taken into account either. However, if Heathrow Airports Limited were to lodge a planning application with the local authority, which would probably be Hillingdon, I suppose, then there would, under the terms of the airport's national policy statement, have to be a public inquiry. So at that public inquiry, the date that public inquiry goes ahead, which will be the day the planning application was submitted, all those things that I just said couldn't be taken into account for the Heathrow High Court and Supreme Court cases, could be at a planning inquiry. So if there were ever a planning inquiry, I'm pretty confident we would win, because just Heathrow, just the third runway at Heathrow expanding alone would drive a coach and horses through the carbon budgets for the next 20 or 30 years in terms of emissions. But even the chief executive of Heathrow now says that they have no plans to think about it for 10 years. Mind you, we wouldn't believe a word he said. He said there'd be no second runway. He said there'd be no third terminal. So, but we'll see. But I'm fairly confident. So what really did matter in losing the case was that the airport's national policy statement is now lawful. So there's lots of other stuff that makes a lot of difference to regional and local airports in that policy statement. And until we get a local airport that wins grounds on climate and environmental bases, then regionally and locally we're stuck. But Bristol Airport, the local authority, which is North Somerset District Council, threw out the expansion of Bristol Airport, which is in the southwest of England, for those who aren't in the UK. They threw it out on climate and environmental grounds, and now that is going to public inquiry, which is already opened and adjourned, and the rest of it will be heard in July. So that will be a real test case, and I would argue more important than the Heathrow case. So if we win there at that public inquiry, then that will set a precedent for airport expansion throughout the UK on climate and environmental grounds. So all eyes to watch that. But there were two outcomes from the Heathrow case that are still ongoing, and Tim, the director of Plan B, who was one of the original plaintiffs, along with Friends of the Earth, who actually got through to the second stage after the High Court. I won't go into any more detail, don't panic. Before the Supreme Court gave their judgment just before Christmas, he got it, and Friends of the Earth got it 24 hours before the verdict was given, and he broke the protocol by publicising what the verdict would be. And at the moment, the Director General for Public Prosecutions is investigating him for contempt of court. So the last we heard was last Monday, I think it was. They asked Plan B and Tim Crossland to write to the Director of Public Prosecutions to put his case. So we don't know yet whether he's going to be prosecuted for contempt. If they do, then obviously there'll be fundraisers for him to defend himself and fight his case right up until the end. The government would be pretty stupid to go ahead and prosecute him, because it'll be a fantastic publicity. But the government have made some pretty stupid decisions, so they may well make that one. And it separately from that, Plan B are taking the human rights aspects of the Heathrow decision to the European Court of Human Rights, on the basis that the old 2 degrees centigrade target, which was the one that was taken into account in this case, is a breach of the right to life, which is one of the articles of the Human Rights Act. And finally, you'll be relieved to hear, is that an organisation called Good Law had previously written to the government about other national policy statements after the government amended the Climate Change Act to put in the new target of net zero by 2050, to say that it was the energy national policy statement hadn't been updated in light of that change to the Climate Change Act. And the Climate Change Act says that if a material change occurs, it must be the national policy statements must be updated, and they haven't been. So the government conceded that they needed to update the energy national policy statement. So they've now written to the government to say that, well, you need to update the airport's national policy statement in light of that as well. And they replied on Monday, the day before yesterday, the government, to say they need more time to reply. So they've now got until the 1st of February to reply on that. So it may well be that we end up having the national policy statement for airports withdrawn by the government in order to update it. And if they do that, then they'll have to review quite a lot of the other stuff in there that's already out of date on climate science, because it was written before the 1.5 special report from the IPCC, so it'd have to be in line with that as well, which would really, really help fighting aviation expansion on climate change grounds. In fact, it would probably prevent it. So that's probably enough on Heathrow, isn't it?
Yeah, it seems to be quite like an interesting case with a lot of ramifications for that people need to keep an eye on in the future.
Yeah, and watch Bristol.
Yeah,
in July. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll keep an eye on that as well. Lots of interesting stuff happening this summer as well. So, so we've also heard that you have an exciting update to share about an action pod and sort of an open call for people to get involved. Would you like to tell us about it?
Well, we've part of the funding. We always sneak into funding applications something that supports direct action, and sometimes they spot it and sometimes they don't. And so this will be for members of Stay Grounded, so it'd have to be members. But I'm sure after this, GAF will be signing up anyway. But some of this action pot that we've got for aviation campaigns and airport actions is only available until the end of March. So it has to be applied for, and whatever it is that's applied for done by the end of March, or we have to give the money back. So we're quite desperate to give it to people. So if anybody's aware of any aviation group or any other group who wants to take action on aviation, then let us have an application, and we'll try and get rid of the money. But it is just for Stay Grounded members only. That was a stipulation of the funder. So it's quite a lot of money. We've got one for European actions and one that's worldwide. I'm not sure how much is left in the European one, but in the global one, there's €2,000, I think, left. So email info@stay-grounded.org if you want to apply, having also been to the website and joined as a member.
Excellent. Yeah, get paid to fly cover airplanes. Yes.
So otherwise, we've got to give the money back, and we really don't want to do that. It's hard enough to get money out of funders in the first place, let alone having to give it back again.
Excellent. Sounds really, really good. So, well, I think you kind of like mentioned it a bit, but yeah, if anyone wants to get involved and support you, how would they go about doing that?
Well, they can send me cases of beer. Alternatively, they can.
I see you use the same system as GAF does. That's good. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we probably do. We're pretty well. Rising Tide and GAF are extraordinarily similar. I would say almost identical, really, but we're just old because we've been going 21 years now. Yeah, so on the website you can join as a member organisation. You can join as an individual member, but we'd rather people joined as groups or organisations. To do that, you'd have to sign up to say that you support the principles in the position paper, and we rely on donations. So it's basically there's no like set membership fee. It's just give what you can, and if you haven't got any money, then you don't give us anything. It's simple as that, really. So if you go to a website and look on Get Active, the drop-down menu has got all the different variations of joining. You can just sign to support the position paper to grow the 260 odd groups that have already signed it without signing up to be a member. you can also just sign up to receive our newsletter as well. But if you sign as a member, you'll get all those things. You don't have to fill in all the different things on there. And if you wanted to regularly donate, there's a pledge form on there that you could fill in as well.
Yeah, excellent.
So it's and it's important to remember the hyphen or the dash between stay and grounded. So it's stay-grounded.org, because stay grounded, all one word, is somebody else.
Excellent.
Don't forget the beer either.
Yeah, maybe we'll send a few beers ourselves. Easier to come out, to come through across than that money, to be honest. And lastly, before we go to the open Q&A section, I'm going to abuse my position as presenter and start with my own question that came out during the discussion, which is some of the kind of like the principles and changes that you talk about in your principal statements have like quite radical implications, like when we talk about like transforming economies to be more local and less reliant on like transcontinental like commerce and all that, and supporting like indigenous rights. All of those things are like really, really good and really, really important. And I'm so glad that they are included, but they are quite radical in its implications. Like they can't go against how like the economy of a lot of the the biggest countries in the world go about, who still rely on a lot of new colonialism and destruction of indigenous land. All this is the bread and butter of the empire, as it were. So how have you been navigating that tension between like having those like kind of like quite radical like objectives and having to like negotiate with local authorities, corporations, governments, and all these kind of things?
Well, I think some of those ideas that were or appeared radical 4 or 5 years ago now aren't so much. Things move to the mainstream quite quickly sometimes. I mean, for example, I think there's 17 different Friends of the Earth national organisations, as well as Friends of the Earth International, that have signed up not just to support the paper, but to be members. That's not something that I would have anticipated, to be honest. Friends of the Earth International may be, but some of the country Friends of the Earth networks are how shall I describe them politely? Fluffy. So I think some of those ideas aren't as radical as they first appear. I think everybody realises if you're a climate activist or even environmental activist, I think you fairly soon realise that system change is absolutely necessary. And you can argue about how we change that system, but I think that more and more people are coming around to the idea that system change is going to be necessary. So whether you want to call that the overthrow of capitalism or something else, then it's up to each person to choose, I suppose. So it hasn't. I don't think it has been as much of a problem as I might have anticipated, and you suggest. What do you think, Callum?
Yeah, I think I'd agree. I think it's I think going back to your question, it wasn't so much. We haven't done a lot of, I guess, we don't really lobby or anything directly very much. So we haven't really engaged with governments or corporations in that kind of way. We've more campaigned against action at various points in different ways. But I think the degree to which other organisations and people have not been shocked by the things that we very clearly stand for and kind of want to kind of like promote. It's kind of is in that. I mean, the fact that we've got as I say, as we've mentioned so far, trade union members, the fact that we've had other kind of much sort of more dry sort of campaigners, or less radical campaigners, should I say, sort of join up as members and be quite happy to sign up to. I think maybe there's just a wider change that's happened that I was noticing it, where suddenly actually there is a wider acceptance that a lot of these things are going to have to change, or are just fundamentally problematic to begin with.
That's really good to hear. And yeah, so now I've run out of questions. So if there's anyone in the chat who wants to ask their own questions, feel free to either like unmute yourself and ask the question, or if you don't want to speak out, you can also write them and I'll read them aloud. I can always prefer if people speak themselves, so I have to do less work, because that's always good. But I won't hold it against you if you don't want to, like, if you're a bit shy.
Hey, it's Pete. I'm going to unmute myself because I've never found how to raise a hand on Zoom. Because I was going to try raising my hand, but I don't know how to do it. Thank you very much, Steve and Callum. That was awesome. Super interesting. More information than my poor brain can hold. Too many. I'm very impressed about all the knowledge you guys have. I guess maybe for me, my main thought always when talking about aviation, maybe it's a bit of a tangent, but it's kind of, aviation seems to be, because it's so directly linked also to tourism, it's one of those sectors that is too big to fail in a way, because tourism for many parts of the world, many countries or many regions is something that they depend on to survive. Like there's regions of the world that have gone into a second recession because COVID cancelled holidays this tourist period, which is a problem in of itself, that that regions are so dependent upon something like that, because that's also a deeper problem of capitalism, that we're all so dependent upon money and the flow of capital. But more insidious for me than the dependence of so many people upon tourism, which is so directly linked to aviation, is, and I've met lots of people like that in my daily working life, especially in countries like the UK in the north, where people usually do fly to go on their holidays, because in other parts of the world, people don't fly to go on their holidays. Like where I'm from, most people don't go on holidays abroad. They can't afford it. They go on local holidays. But in the UK, most people do go on holidays abroad. And for me, like, it's a broader problem of that people hate their daily lives and they hate their work so much that they literally only live for these brief holidays abroad. So that's just like a broader problem of capitalism and the actual mess of a society that we've got ourselves in. And that feels to me personally very much linked with the whole aviation thing, and how people, when you say anti-aviation, react so badly, because it's like you're going to take away from them the only thing they live for, which is escaping their lives.
Specifically escaping UK.
Yeah, and I'm really sorry that this didn't end up in a question and it more ended up in a rant. But maybe you guys can find a question in there and
I'll have a go if you like. Well, that's one of the things that in our Just Transition paper, which isn't out yet, so that's one of the things we've dealt with or tried to deal with is tourism, particularly ecotourism, which is a route that quite a few countries, Costa Rica probably the best example, have sort of repositioned their economy to actually cater for ecotourism. But still, that's,
Uh,
as we
whoops.
mentioned it.
What is
We mentioned
ecotourism?
earlier.
Could you explain what is
It's
ecotourism?
Pardon?
Could you explain what is ecotourism? I'm not familiar with the term.
Flying middle-class people from Britain and other countries to other side of the world to look at the nature and the wildlife and live in a log cabin or a tree house or
right.
that type of thing.
Sure.
But I mean, if you look at any of the big NGOs in the UK, like the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, even Friends of the Earth, when they had a monthly magazine, it's full of ecotourism adverts, all of which you have to fly to. But it's still maybe not quite the elite, but it's like the next tier of income level that can afford holidays like that. So not only do we say in that paper that there's got to be a transition that ideally would be just from the jobs in the aviation sector and the tourism sector to other sectors, but also there's got to be a transition from how people travel, and so if we start off by targeting, as was mentioned earlier, a working class family from north of England who have their 2 weeks in Torremolinos every year, if people still go to Torremolinos, then we're not going to get any success out of that. You don't start by targeting those people. You start with the people that are doing the most damage, and you gradually work your way down as you try and wind down and transition the entire industry. But I think that announcement that came out was only today from the CCOO, who apparently have got 1 million members in Spain. I haven't read the report yet because I only got the email today. But I mean, when they're talking about proposals for a new tourism model, so it'd be interesting to see what similarities there are between their publication and ours when it comes out in a couple of weeks. And they say, however, it's possible to opt for a diversified form of interior and proximity tourism, less dependent on aviation and related to cultural and artistic heritage, sustainable outdoor sports, or nature tourism with environmental constraints. So I think it's really interesting that a big trade union has come out with that, and it's been supported by the big Spanish NGOs. You might argue, well, how come the big Spanish NGOs haven't been working on that beforehand? And it's because people just haven't been. It's something that's not been done until the pandemic hit us. So I think it's like it's not called transition for nothing. It's a gradual process. But of course, the longer we leave it, the less just it's going to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth saying just to add on the trade unions document. It's kind of in the header. It does have a lot of NGOs in Spain along with it, which is promising. But yeah, I agree, P, that I think the fundamental problem is systemic with tourism, and actually having a conversation about tourism alongside talking about aviation is important. It's but it makes it a much bigger problem than just flying, and part of the problem with messaging it is because it's so wrapped up in people's daily experiences and how they see flying on holiday, and how equally people in particular areas really dependent on tourism see tourism, and actually the wider kind of perceptions and realities that people have around that, where the holidays are actually really important in a world where you have oppressive employment and not enjoyable or worthwhile jobs. You actually have to tackle that at the same time to shift how people perceive flying away on holiday, and actually make daily life livable, which makes it a much bigger challenge than something that one organisation like us can do. But it's certainly a conversation that we need to be having, because we all need to be, fighting for that post-capitalist livable society.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really important discussion, and having kind of like being in contact with areas kind of like really affected by this kind of tourism is, I think it's completely unsustainable. I remember a graffiti from in some like a wall in the streets of Barcelona that said like less tourists, more immigrants. That's definitely a very important discussion to have. I think we had a good question in the chat. With us, I think in relation to the campaign, the funding you were talking about before, which regions can apply for funding for aviation? I think just to clarify, maybe it wasn't very clear.
We have money for both. We have a global action pot and an EU action pot. So if you're interested, get in touch. Certainly the EU or the European one, I think, is for members. I imagine they're both for members, so you would have to sign up as a member organisation. But as Steve mentioned, that's not a complicated process. It just means that you have to fill in a form and probably agree to what we stand for and the rest of it. So so there's both.
Can we just clarify if it's Europe or the EU, because the EU is smaller than Europe?
It's Europe. I think it's Europe. Yeah. I think it's European. Yeah. Because it's European.
That'll include the UK. So this is not just the EU. But the important thing about the European one is that the application and whatever you do with the money has got to be completed by the end of March.
Yeah.
Cool. I hope that makes it clear, and hopefully some people find it useful and take a bit of advantage of it. I don't know if there's any more questions. I cannot see any others in the chat, but I think we had like a pretty good discussion anyway. And I'm sure you're getting tired as well after talking for so long. So thank you so much for being here with us today. It was really, really good listening to all the stuff you've been organizing, and we really hope that there's a wider awareness of these issues in the public, and also more concrete action taken about it. So thanks so much.
Thanks for having us. It's been great to chat.
And we'll definitely like talk about GAF signing up at some point. So
we definitely encourage it. We've follow all the stuff you do. We'd love to have you guys involved, and have your name on our list of members, certainly.
Yeah, and if anybody is sad enough to want to know more about the Heathrow case, then if you go to our website on the information drop down menu and click on news. That's where people submit blogs for our website, and I've done a couple on there about the Heathrow case from the beginning, and I'm about to do another one when I have a chance. And you can still send a beer.
Excellent.
Well, we should definitely do is make a plan for buying you guys a beer when we're allowed to.
Oh, that'd be good. I've been in a pub since March the 18th.
The date.
One very techie question, since we're reaching the end, is what does it actually mean? Maybe we went through that before, but what does it actually mean to be a member of Stay Grounded? Like, what are the obligations?
There's not a huge amount of obligations as such. I mean, we are a network, so we're trying to bring people together to collaborate and in some cases advocate for on things like bailouts. For sort of on behalf of our members, but really with our members. It's really something where we're all doing it together. We're not really not doing it for people. We're doing it as a collective. So you're basically putting your name to that, and you're committing to sign up to the 13 points that Steve talked about earlier on. And really the only obligation on you is if you agree with us that those things are important. As Steve said, we're very, very pleased that people are also willing to pitch in money to help us function, but that's not an obligation.
Yeah, I mean, if people join, there's like a set of what we call protocols. Only they're not really rules. It's just we couldn't think of a word to describe them, of what the obligations are. So another one is to have one person from the group who's agreed by everybody in the group or organisation to be on our members list, because that's what we use for quick decision making. But then there's a discussion list as well that anybody can be on. I think it's actually an open rise up list. But for the UK in particular, we've set up a list that stay grounded members and friends, because there are certain organisations in the UK who couldn't be members of Stay Grounded, but we wanted to link everybody up in the UK that's campaigning on aviation, because there have been aviation lists in the past. In fact, I think I've set up the Plain Stupid one. But so there've been direct action lists, and there've been like lobbying groups for people that are part of consultative committees for local airports, and there's been lots of local residents groups who mostly concerned with noise rather than climate or any environmental issues. But there's never been a communication method with all those people in the same forum. So we've set up an email list where we'll basically have anybody who's part of a group campaigning on aviation or airports in the UK, and there's a lot of them, and we've got 70 odd groups on the list so far, and we're in communication with another 30 or 40. So it's quite surprising how many airports there are around the UK that you've never heard of or don't know anything about. So if you transpose that to worldwide, then there's plenty of people out there that if they're only campaigning about noise, then at least they're campaigning on aviation, I suppose. I'd rather they took a leaf out of the Maasai's book and drove their cattle onto the runway, but we can't all do that, I suppose.
But always an option.
Yeah, I mean, and more generally, I mean, we're keen. We're always keen to have another sort of especially anti-capitalist voice in the discussion. So to have you folks on board would be certainly constructive, and that goes for I mean, it would, but that goes for other organisations that people here might be members of, and it's we really want a kind of diversity of groups in terms of things like what we've talked about, these papers and reports we can put together. Those are broadly with inputs from our members, and we do try and go wider if we can to specific groups who might be relevant or affected. But the more voices we have on the inside to start with, you might be able to even just read something through or contribute a perspective is really, it makes it all the more inclusive.
Excellent. So I think we're gonna draw to a close for today. And thank you again for being here. It's been really, really good. I encourage everyone to check your website and to find out and to collaborate and get involved. And
thanks for asking us.
And really, it's been our pleasure. And really quickly before we go, although we don't have any kind of like live streams or anything like that organized by, let's say, or affinity group coming up, the absolute legends are Glasgow GAF. Are organizing an online open meeting, the next 26th of January, to organize for the COP26 convention that is coming up, supposedly at some point, and how to respond to it. So that's going to be really interesting. So if you are looking, maybe if you are somewhere in the area or you're looking to organize around COP26, definitely come to this. And coordinate with them. I'm sure it's going to be really, really interesting. And I think that's going to be all for us. Thank you so much to everyone who for listening, and yeah, and I hope to see you all soon. Hope to that we all can see each other soon in the streets as well. And yeah, thank you so much. See you in the streets. Take care. Goodbye.